In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at another Nvidia graphics card. It is a slightly older model, but they do seem to be quite rare in this configuration. I've been searching for this graphics card for a while now, and to be honest, I accidentally stumbled upon it. It is back from when Nvidia cared about the entry-level budget gamers, and it is adorably cute as well. So for those of you that don't know, this is the Nvidia Geforce GTX 650 Ti, and what makes this one special is that it is an ITX version. As you can see, it's a tiny little small thing, but it also comes with 2 GB of VRAM. Now they do seem a little bit rare because most of the time these come in 1 GB, and to get the 2 GB you need the slightly larger card, the boost version, but I accidentally stumbled on this one by purchasing a 1 GB version from eBay and a 2 GB actually arriving. You can tell that it is a 2 GB because the actual code on the back, or the product number, does literally specifically say it's a 2 GB model, so I'm not exactly sure what the seller was selling, but I actually managed to benefit out of this because I got the one that I wanted. I do think this card is absolutely adorable, and the one that we've got specifically is from EVGA. It is the EVGA GeForce GTX 650 Ti, and it does come with an additional power socket, so you will need one of them. It means that this card probably was never very useful for dropping into pre-builds, but it would have offered a great price to performance for entry-level gamers. Underneath this tiny and adorable shroud is a card that is sitting on a Kepler architecture. It has 928 MHz base clock speed. It has 768 shaders. This specific model has 2 GB of VRAM, sitting on a 128-bit memory bus. It has an interface of a PCIe Gen 3 by 16, a reasonably low TDP of only 110 watts, and it was obviously released in 2012 with an MSRP between £120 and £150, depending on which model that you actually got. Now, unfortunately, in 2024, these cards are quite limited, and that's because they don't actually officially support DirectX 12. That does mean that there is a limitation on the games that we can actually test with this, and we did see that when we were actually testing. The first lot of games that I decided to test this against was our normal test suite, which is mostly made up of games from 2023, and it really did struggle. There were a few games in our test list that were actually completely unplayable. The first was Dead Island 2. The game just simply wouldn't start up. You could actually get to the main menu of it, but then it would actually crash, so that was a non-starter. Then we had Spider-Man Remastered, which was quite surprising because that game generally does run on a lot of hardware, particularly older hardware. We have some good experiences with that. But again, when we got to the startup screen, the game just crashed back to Windows. That meant that those games were just completely unplayable. So we decided to move on with something slightly older. The next game that we tested was Doom Eternal, and quite surprisingly, the game actually started up fine, but it ran very bad. We could only get the game really running in a 720p resolution with a low preset, and even then we could only get 39 frames per second with a 1% low of 20. The game also gave us a lot of driver warnings, particularly because this card isn't supported anymore when it started up, and due to the lack of VRAM, we just couldn't get the game to play in anything over the low. Even then though, the game does actually run reasonably fine, but it gives a very bad experience. We also tried High on Life. That game is not the most demanding game, and it was actually released in around 2022, so it's now reasonably old. We actually managed to play it in a 1080p resolution with a low preset, and we got an average of 45 frames per second with a 1% low of 21. Now the game started up perfectly fine, but it looked absolutely terrible on those low settings, and it wasn't very smooth. The game was juddery throughout, so it didn't give a very good experience. Now, because of the experience we had with modern games and the fact that it wouldn't run half of them, and even the ones that it would actually run very badly, we decided instead we would test this against a bit of a retro catalogue instead. I decided to test this card against some of my most favourite games, just to see how well it would perform in games that were probably more appropriate for its age. Now, the first game up in our full testing was Black Mesa. I've actually added that to our retro catalogue really because lots of people have been asking for it, and because it is a remaster, it's kind of quite demanding on hardware while also being on older engines, so it's not so much. We ran that game in a 1080p with a high preset, and we managed to get an average of 99 frames per second with a 1% low of 55. Now the game loaded exceptionally fast, and it played beautiful in these settings. It looked great in 1080p with high settings, and it played exceptionally smooth with that high FPS. This meant that we got a fantastic experience out of this game, and it's one you can definitely play on a GTX 650 Ti. We didn't have as much luck with the next game that we tested, which was actually quite surprising. We decided to test Dead Island 1. Now that game is quite old now, and testing it in a 1080p resolution with a medium preset, we could only get an average of 35 frames per second with a 1% low of of 27. The game just didn't perform very well at all on this GPU, and with a medium preset it looked terrible. Bumping it up to 1080p with a high preset, you could barely get 30 FPS, which just wasn't good. But lowering it to the medium did mean that we could actually get it playable. It just wasn't looking very good at all, and it was very juddery. It just meant that this GPU is not powerful enough to play this game at an enjoyable experience, and that is a real shame. In Halo 4 with a 1080p resolution and a high preset, we managed to get a phenomenal 102 frames per second with a 1% low of 68. That meant that the game played beautifully smooth with the high FPS, and you got a high FPS experience out of it. It looked very good in a high setting, and it gave you an awesome experience. Now, a game that I haven't played or tested in a very long time is of course Medal of Honor Airborne. This game is not demanding at all, it's very old now, and if the GTX 650 Ti didn't play it, I would be highly surprised. We played this game with a 1080p resolution and a high preset, and we managed to get an average of 168 frames per second with a 1% low of 112. That meant that the game ran beautifully smooth with a high FPS experience, and the graphics did actually still hold up well today, even for the age of the game. There was absolutely no issues in running this game on this GPU at all. The game is a classic, and if you haven't played it, you should definitely check it out. The last game in the testing is one that you've seen before on the channel, and is one that we generally opt for when testing older GPUs, and of course this game is Tomb Raider. Running the game in a 1080p resolution with a medium preset, it looked fantastic, and you got a high FPS experience. We managed to get here an average of 81 frames per second with a 1% low of 68. The game didn't feel as smooth as it does on other graphics cards, especially when turning very quickly, but the medium preset did actually provide a decent quality picture, and it was more than playable throughout. Overall, the GTX 650 Ti worked fine, and there were absolutely no issues with the system at all, or with any drivers outside of them not working for some of the latest greatest games. During all of our testing, the card stuck to around 50 degrees while gaming, and was actually quite quiet throughout, so you're going to get a decent experience for this. And to be honest, in my opinion, I think that it actually makes this card a fantastic card for retro gamers. If you are building a retro gaming system and you want to kind of put an old platform together and get something that can really work for those older games, this is a card that you should probably choose. Its low TDP means that it will pretty much run on any kind of power supply. It does require a 6-pin connection, so you have to be careful of that, but the additional RAM that it actually provides compared to the more common version is actually going to really help out with those retro games. I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to be doing with this GPU going forward. I am going to add it to the collection, and I'm sure you guys will see it in the future. There are some more modern games out there that actually do list these as their minimum requirements, so maybe we'll do a game versus minimum requirement on this one day. I don't know. Let me know in the comments below what you think we should do. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content. We do have a few more older GPUs coming up, particularly Nvidia ones that you will want to see. And I'm sure, as always, we'll catch you guys in the next one.